everybody. So welcome to Anthropology A208, the bureaucratic name for this otherwise much better termed class that I like to call Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll, SDRnR for short, and kind of like a subtitle of Subversive Culture, which is an idea we're going to get to later in the video today. Just to start out with a bit of introductions, first of all, myself, I'm Shane Greene, the professor for this course. I've been faculty in the Department of Anthropology here at IU for 15 years plus at this point. Teach a variety of things related to sort of social movements, art, music, popular culture. I'm going to turn it over briefly to Meg Morley, who's the associate instructor for the course, so she can also do a brief introduction.
Hi, I'm Meg Morley. I'm the Associate Instructor, or AI, for this course, and this is my third semester working with Shane on this class. That means that I'm responsible for grading your assignments, and so if you ever have questions about what the assignments are requiring, or you want feedback on a paper, or you're just confused about class content, you can contact me at Canvas or my email address, which is in the syllabus. Double check the spelling of my last name because people always get it wrong. I'm currently a PhD candidate in cultural anthropology here at IU, and my research is in Egypt, where I study how globalization is changing the belly dance industry in Cairo. I also have a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of London, and for undergrad I studied technical theater and German at a small liberal arts college in Ohio, but I'm originally from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Behind me you see my cat Farida, who is named for a famous Egyptian folkloric dancer, and if you ever schedule a Zoom meeting with me, there's a 99.9% chance that she will be sitting right there judging us. Yeah. You can always contact me if you have questions, and I hope you have a good semester.
So very, very quickly, course rundown. All right, the basic, super basic stuff. This is all on the syllabus, as they say. And if you send me emails or messages asking for details about X or Y, if I in fact already know it's on the syllabus, I'll probably just say, hey, it's on the syllabus. So this is just to try to reinforce in very, very broad strokes all of the more detailed information about each one of these things on the syllabus, okay? First of all, the overarching format for this course, given the scenario that global scenario that we now find ourselves in, is what they call in bureaucratic terms online asynchronous. Basically that means all of the content, all of the interaction is taking place virtually online in various different platforms and formats. Asynchronous means basically we're never going to meet in person, nor meet simultaneously online, like say in kind of a Zoom session kind of scenario, right? I'm going to upload content, you guys are going to upload content, I'm going to respond to the content you guys upload, and so on, and kind of back and forth. And to give that a little bit of a kind of structured feel so that people aren't too confused, I'm going to try to keep it fairly straightforward, okay? So basically the way the weeks are going to work, it's sort of divided up into a 15-weekly format. Every week on Monday, I'm going to send out a weekly email that kind of lists and details what's happening that week in the course, right? So there's not multiple communications happening in a given week. So there's a sort of Monday morning weekly email that summarizes everything. Most importantly, on Mondays or by Mondays, I will be able to send you a link in that email to a video lecture just like this one that I will have produced in my basement using a green screen to try to hopefully make it a little bit more engaging and interesting as we go. I will send you a YouTube link for the video lectures that I produce at home, because frankly, Canvas and the Cultura section, media section of Canvas is a disaster when it comes to really, really big files, media files. And so I'm going to be uploading those sort of lengthy 35 to 45 minute lecture videos on a YouTube platform and sending out the link, right? Because it's just a much more stable platform that is made for this kind of thing, right? So that's what will come out in the Monday email. In that Monday weekly email, there will also be sort of instructions, a prompt essentially for what we're calling reaction paragraphs. These are basically weekly with a few exceptions when you have other assignments due. There's 11 of them in total. So almost every week you're going to be writing a weekly paragraph. It's defined specifically in the syllabus what a paragraph means, how to take it seriously, how to do really, really well and get an A basically on this if you simply turn them in on time. They're going to be due, the weeks that they are due, which is 11 out of the 15 weeks, at 7 p.m. on Tuesday nights. Must get it in even 30 seconds late, it's over, that's it, you don't get to turn it in, all right? You can read more of the details about how those and the sort of penalties that kind of accrue if you don't turn them in or don't take them seriously. So be sure to look at that on the syllabus, okay? Crucial thing, 7 p.m. Tuesday, do not be late. Canvas will not let you submit it, and we will not allow you to submit them. You get one mistake. You get to miss one. There have to be at least 10 to get a kind of perfect, which is a 96A grade on this assignment, and then you can look at the penalties that accrue if you don't take it seriously enough, if you start missing them, if you turn in nonsense, and so on and so forth. Okay. So you turn those in on Tuesday, and I use those reaction paragraphs to whatever question or prompt I issued in the weekly Monday email to respond to you, all right? In a more kind of spontaneous, rather than this kind of highly produced in my basement green screen video, I will do a more kind of spontaneous response. And usually, since I'll be doing those kind of spontaneously, I'll probably do them using the Kaltura Zoom option in Canvas. So those kind of instructor or professor responses to your reaction paragraphs will be uploaded by Friday, most likely not on YouTube, but in the Kaltura section of Canvas, okay? So that's the kind of feel of the course, right, from week to week. There are exceptions when you have like short papers due or the final video project due, where I won't make you do the reaction paragraph, just to kind of cut you a break and allow you to sort of focus your efforts on those assignments. In terms of the broader kind of grades and grading breakdown in assignments, basically there's 4 components to this. 20, 30, 30, 20 is the breakdown. 20% these reaction paragraphs that I just mentioned, you have to get them in on time. You have to get at least 10 out of the 11 in to get basically an A, all right? From that point forward, when you start making mistakes, not getting it in on time, turning in 1 or 2 sentences instead of a full 5 to 6 sentence paragraph, those kinds of things that are spelled out on the syllabus, we start deducting points, right? So everybody in theory, if you just do this and take it seriously, will get an A on that particular 20% of the grade, right? The reaction paragraphs. 30% for both the first and second paper, sort of 2 short papers, kind of 2.5 to 3 page each paper, in response to sort of like showing you can apply some of the basic concepts that we're using in the course, oftentimes with a lot of choice in terms of what you can actually write about. So those are the first and second papers, both short, roughly the same size. And then the final 20% is this thing I call a reflection video project. So a different medium, different forum for you to express your ideas and explore your ideas with as much creative flair as you want to in the production and or editing of the video. But there's no requirement there. It's really the content fundamentally that we're looking for. So creative flair is absolutely welcome, but not required. It's the content. And this is just a sort of a final kind of chance at the very end of the semester to use a different medium, video, and a 3 to 4 minute kind of short format to express a kind of personal reflection and understanding of some core text or film that we have explored in the course of this semester. And then sort of to use that reflection to sort of ask the question of how it might apply to actually your own personal experience, right? In a fundamentally different kind of format, right, and medium. So that's the basics, nuts and bolts of what you have to do for the class. Finally, if you need to communicate with either myself or with Meg, the associate instructor, the best way to do that is there's basically 2 modes, right? So every Tuesday, I at least will leave my Canvas chat session, the chat section of Canvas open from roughly 9 to 11 a.m. just for anybody who wants to chat, to say hi, to say what's up, to tell me a joke, to ask a question. That's a public format. So if you're going to engage with me or anyone else at that particular moment on Tuesdays from 9 to 11, beware that it's, of course, a public format, right? It should be something that you're not, you're sort of fine with sharing with other people. If you need a more confidential kind of setting, an individual kind of consultation, just email me or Meg or send us a Canvas message and we'll set up a Zoom appointment, most likely, to touch base and try to resolve whatever the issue is, okay? So that's the basics of how this course is going to run, all right? And the full details are all in the syllabus. Now, finally, before we launch into the other 2 main kind of parts of what I want to talk about today, which are the inspiration for the course and then the sort of 3 basic kind of concepts I want to lay out as a cultural anthropologist to sort of start moving forward. Before we get to all that, you might have noticed that one of the first things that went out on this course, went on the course sort of Canvas messaging to the entire student body that's enrolled in the course, is a notification about the course content. I will be honest, I don't love sort of trigger warnings and sort of like constant kind of notification of what to expect or what to be potentially afraid of or be aware of and so on and so forth. But in a course like this, they're particularly necessary for a variety of reasons. It's, sort of spelled out in that form, but essentially, what I want to sort of suggest to people is that you've signed up for a course called Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll. You should expect there to be some sex, some talk of drugs, and some, kind of crazy music as we move forward in the semester, right? That's what the course is about. So there's no way that I can account for, like, literally there's 90 people enrolled at the moment. There's no way I can count for all the radical kind of diversity in your perspectives, your political views, your ideological views, your religious views, your family background, all of that kind of stuff, your cultural background, perhaps different nationalities, different languages spoken. Like, it's very difficult for me to know exactly what people have or have not been exposed to. So simply from the get-go, from the start, want to warn you about some of the content, right? Much of the content will be sort of your standard kind of academic fare, but there will be distinct moments as we move through different texts or different films or look at certain songs or look at certain videos and that kind of thing, that from certain points of view might be seen as potentially offensive or scandalous or shocking. Really depends on kind of where you're coming from, right? And what your point of view is. It's the nature of the course itself in a fundamental sense, right? As you'll see as we explore further today. With the very term like subversive culture, which I told you is in the subtitle of the course, you should expect some degree of sort of eye-opening to happen. So I wanted to call attention to this sort of piece from 2015 by Todd Gittman that came out in the Chronicle of Higher Education. It's one of many pieces that have kind of emerged over the recent years, sort of warning us about the constant tendency to sort of warn people about course content in academic settings. Like, it's necessary, and at the same time, like, why would you go to college to simply have your worldview fundamentally reinforced? Like, don't you want to, not that you're being forced to take on a different worldview, but don't you want to at least kind of be challenged or sort of have your eyes open to other possibilities and potentials that exist in the world, right? And so when he says, no one ever promised that the truth would be comforting, discomfort is the crucible of learning, putting emphasis on that particular phrase, right? Discomfort is the crucible of learning. The world is disconcerting. The proper way to begin understanding it is to accept the unwritten contract of university education. I am here to be disturbed. In other words, I am here to be at least a little bit shaken out of my complacency, out of sort of my worldview, to sort of open myself up to other ideas, right? That doesn't mean we're forcing them on you or that you have to conform to them. In fact, that's one of the messages of this class, right? Don't conform. But nonetheless, you're going to want to like sort of, be exposed to other things, right? And so I simply want to sort of suggest that like you sort of start with openness, right? And also sort of be prepared that there will be some things that you wouldn't typically see in a lot of other courses as well, right? Certainly if there's a whole section dedicated to sex and sexuality, you should be prepared to see sexual images, right? Sexual activity, right? And some of the content that we're going to talk about and some of the films and some of the videos. If we're going to talk about very subversive forms of music once we get towards the end and various points along the way, you should expect to hear various kinds of lyrical content, right, or lyrical messaging that isn't considered in different historical moments and times and places very graphic and very illicit and very explicit in some scenarios, right? If there's a section called drugs, you should probably expect that we're going to talk fairly openly about drugs, right, and from a variety of different perspectives, right? So in other words, sort of prepare yourself. This is not your everyday course. That's kind of how I designed it.
On a journey from which you will never return.
Let's talk a little bit about the inspiration for this course. And one of the first things I want you to do is actually just go ahead and pause the video, all right? Go to this suggested link, YouTube link that's hovering above my head right now, and check out that video, all right? Watch the whole thing and listen to it and then come back. Okay, so now that I have you back, presumably you have watched this 4 or 5 minute sort of video. I want to ask you a question. I'm asking it rhetorically because you're not there. I'm looking at a phone. How many of you have actually heard this phrase, sex, drugs, and rock and roll? The answer almost inevitably, since I've been doing this course for years, is basically everybody. In fact, I think in like 5, 6, 7 years of doing this course, maybe one person out of hundreds and hundreds of students has said no to that question. Have you heard the phrase sex, drugs, and rock and roll? Curiously, a lot of people, when I pose a follow-up question, which is, do you know where it comes from? The answer is no, not really, typically, right? Almost always the answer is the exact inverse of the first scenario where everybody raises their hands, yes, have heard that, to the second scenario where basically nobody has any idea where the hell this phrase, sex, drugs, and rock and roll comes from. Well, there's a much longer story to tell, but I'm going to tell you a short version of the story, which is that in the late 1960s, in the context of the sort of the anti-war movement, the emergence of sort of what was called at the time the counterculture, which meant sort of hippie culture, sort of psychedelic rock culture, a sort of popular kind of visibilization of kind of youth protest and a sort of new youth styles and so on and so forth. There was a Life magazine article that used this phrase to reference that context, that kind of social, political, cultural, artistic context, right? Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So it was sort of a press setting, right? Fast forward several years later, mid-1970s, amongst, now the sort of hippie moment has kind of come and gone, and what becomes, and we'll talk about it later on in the course, the punk moment in the mid-1970s starts to explode and represent the kind of new iconic underground youth subculture, and a series of bands emerge, some of which you've probably no doubt heard of: the Sex Pistols, the Ramones, Blondie, who knows who else. A band you're probably somewhat less likely to have heard of is Ian Dury and the Blockheads. And that band and this song in particular that they named Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll is the inspiration for this course, all right? And so given that, and given that you watched that video, what I want us to do is start by doing a kind of deep interpretation of this song, right, from this band, Ian Dury and the Blockheads, that inspired the course. Curious thing about him is he sort of visually embodies a kind of punk aesthetic, right? The little bowler hat, the sort of long trench coat, the weird haircut, right? Weird jewelry, all of these kinds of things. And the sort of photo that I've got here on our sort of slides, this sort of skull and crossbones kind of thing happening. But the sound of the band at multiple points, in this song and in others, is a weird and interesting mix, sort of fusion of rock. You've got the basic sort of drums, bass, guitar, kind of occasional keyboard kind of thing happening with sort of the rock combo. But there's a punk aesthetic, and in the song itself, at least this particular song, is deeply, deeply in dialogue, obviously with a funk kind of sound, right? So sort of breaking boundaries in a variety of different, or putting things together from a bunch of different kind of musical and aesthetic genres in interesting ways, right? But I want us to look in detail at the lyrics of the song. And curiously enough, this is the mid-1970s, right? So something you might not be able to sort of easily kind of get your head around if you're sort of 19 or 20 and it's 2020 in terms of the kind of evolution of popular culture. The lyrics of this song and the titling of it, Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll, in the mid-1970s in the UK, at that moment, were transgressive enough, subversive enough to get it banned, essentially. By the BBC, right? So you didn't have to go that far just to really kind of piss some people off 40 years ago, right? Compared to what's possible now, right? So just to kind of have a sense of that, right? I want us to look at the sort of verses here. So you obviously, if you heard it, you could very easily pick up on what the chorus is, right? Sex and drugs and rock and roll, right? And it's easily, from the repetitive nature of choruses in general, that chorus in particular, to immediately sort of think that this song is about hedonism, right? Sex and drugs and rock and roll. And a lot of people's kind of first superficial reading of the song is that's what the song is about. You keep saying sex, drugs, and rock and roll over and over and over, and the kind of song goes out on that note, right? Sort of him repeating that line, sex and drugs and rock and roll, almost starting to kind of shout and scream and kind of orgasmically kind of perform this sort of final moment of the song, right? If you start delving into the actual lyrical verses, right, sort of each of the verses, something else is going on. And it's that something else beyond this kind of superficial reading of the hedonistic dimensions of this, or the hedonistic gestures of this, that I want us to sort of focus on, right? Because that's the core inspiration for the concept, for the course itself. It's the concept of the course itself, right? So if you look at the first verse, keep your silly ways or throw them out the window. The wisdom of your ways, I've been there and I know. Lots of other ways. What a jolly bad show. If all you ever do is business you don't like. First basic message, really clear, right? Ponder yourself suddenly in a situation where all you're doing all the time is something you don't want to be doing, okay? Or being something you don't want to be. Feeling like you're something that you are not, right? Crucial to what this course is about. Second verse, every bit of clothing ought to make you pretty. You can cut the clothing gray as such a pity. I should wear the clothing of Mr. Walter Mitty. See my tailor, he's called Simon. I know it's going to fit. Okay, clothing here is a metaphor for something beyond clothing. It's a metaphor for identity, for who you are, right? What your concept of yourself is, what your sort of image of yourself is, what image you project to the world, right, and to others is, right, in dialogue with whatever it is they project about themselves, right? So it's not just clothing, it's what clothing sort of says or does as a sort of form of what we're going to call expressive culture, actually, later on. It's saying something about who you are. And he's basically asking a fairly straightforward question, metaphorically speaking. Do you have the right clothing on, right? Are you projecting really who you are to the world, or are you putting clothing on that doesn't fit you particularly well, right? Maybe you should look for clothing that fits better, suits you more for who you are, right? Notice the mention of Walter Mitty here. Anybody know who Walter Mitty is? Well, let me tell you. In the 1930s, there was a famous kind of American short story writer, James Thurber, who published, it's very short, a very sort of famous little short story about a man named Walter Mitty. Ben Stiller, just a few years ago, maybe more like almost 10 years ago at this point, I can't remember, maybe 2012, 2013, did a Hollywood kind of film version of this. So you might have that more sort of, kind of popular culture reference in your mind, but it goes back to a short story that was written in the 1930s. And if anybody has read that or seen that Ben Stiller movie about Walter Mitty, you know that essentially what's going on in that movie is that it's sort of divided into two. The story progresses in a way, the narrative of the story progresses in a way to suggest that at one level, this man is trapped in a life that he finds utterly boring and relentlessly kind of repetitive and drab. And as a result of that, he has these kind of flashes of daydreams constantly about lives he could have had or should have had, people he could have been or wants to be, but somehow just like couldn't find it in himself to be that, right? So sort of the drab moments where he's like confronting a horrible northeastern winter, and he doesn't know how to put like snow tires on his car. His wife makes fun of him for that. There's a bunch of kind of bitter back and forth between the sort of husband and wife. Clearly it's an unhappy marriage, so he's in a sort of marital situation that he's not at all happy with, but there he is, hasn't extracted himself from it. There's other moments where she's sort of biting into him about the way he drives. There's the job that he has to go to that he hates, right? He has some sort of horrible kind of like bureaucratic office job and so on and so forth that he clearly hates. Like all these sort of gestures towards how basically miserable he is because he's not having the life that he wants, because he's not being the person that he feels inside he wishes he was, right? Or maybe truly is in some basic sense. So these kind of flash moments or sort of daydream moments get introduced into the narrative to suggest that dilemma. Like, are you who you are? Are you who you want to be? Exactly. Can you do anything to be more like that which you want to be or who you want to be, rather than just sort of accept yourself getting sort of sucked into this kind of drab, repetitive life that you don't want to actually do? That's the message, right? So the sort of flashes, they come and go. There's a variety of different sort of scenarios that he's sort of daydreaming himself into. This is the 30s, right? So sort of at a certain moment, he imagines himself as like a sort of World War fighter pilot, having super crazy, fantastical kind of moments in the sky as a fighter pilot. It's very gendered in various ways as well. He imagines himself being like a world-class surgeon surrounded by very attractive nurses, right, who are his assistants, sort of doing these, awe-inspiring kind of surgeries. All of these sort of lives that he sort of imagines himself should have had, he has in fact not had, right? He's sort of confronting that inherent dilemma, right? That's who Walter Mitty is. And it's not an accidental reference here because Mr. Drury is trying to remind us all of that essential dilemma, right? Are you who you want to be, right? Are you sort of striving to be who you want to be, actually, right? Or are you settling in some sense, or hiding perhaps, as we oftentimes also do, who you really are from people because you can't reconcile the things, all right? Okay, so verse 3, right? Here's a little bit of advice. You're quite welcome. It is free. Don't do nothing that is cut price. Cut price is a kind of more British phrasing for the idea of something that's ordinary, right? Or routine, or boring, or simple, or too normal, too basic, as sometimes we say these days, right? Your generation says, not mine. You know what they'll make you be. They will try their tricky device, trap you with the ordinary. There it is, the ordinary, right? That's sort of the seductive kind of trap trap qualities of the ordinary. You can get sucked into it. Get your teeth into a small slice of the cake of liberty. Right? In other words, sort of really pursuing, trying to become who you fundamentally are, whatever that is, all right? Whatever that is, might in fact be precisely the key to feeling liberty, to feeling free at the end of the day, rather than sort of becoming something which you are not. So to sum up, right, on the basis of this song, Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll, which, as I've suggested, is the inspiration for the course itself, which is about more than simply sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right, and that kind of simplistic hedonistic form. Two key concepts, right? If you really put a pinpoint on what it is Mr. Ian Dury is trying to suggest with this song, it is the possibility of nonconformity, right? Of not simply fitting in, right? Of sort of choosing not to simply fit in. That might be a better way of phrasing it, right? Nonconformity, sort of a choice, or sort of, a series of choices through which one decides not to conform with that which is expected, right? In any given scenario, setting, whatever that might be, right? And we'll get more concrete about this as we move forward. That little nugget begs a further question, which is, sort of what is it that a nonconformist stance or nonconformity is struggling against? What's the sort of monster in the room in that particular scenario? We're going to call it, and it's a fairly abstract concept that we're going to explore in much more concrete ways as we move forward, the problem of normativity. Normativity, which is just a fancy way, basically, of saying like sort of a certain kind of structured ideas, beliefs, practices, formations that suggest people subtly or sometimes almost even coercively to move in a particular direction, to do certain things, to act in particular ways, to think certain things, right? And not question them, right? Normativity, that's what normativity is. And a stance of nonconformity is about sort of confronting that, right? Pointing it out, trying to challenge it in some fundamental sense. And that's essentially what this song is about. When he was asked, is that song really about sex, drugs, and rock and roll at various different moments and kind of press interviews, he would always say no. It was about the fact that I didn't really want to get a 9-to-5 job. Like I didn't want to settle for something that I didn't feel represented who I was in life, right? So that duality, nonconformity, a stance of nonconformity, and the problem of normativity, right? The structures of normativity, of which there are multiple, which we'll talk about as we move forward, is essentially what this course was inspired by, right? Sort of a deep reading, if you will, a deep interpretation of that song. Now, what we want to do in the time that I have left is a very, very broad introduction in kind of disciplinary terms, like sort of, this is particular kind of course content and material that could be studied in a variety of different ways, right? How does a cultural anthropologist such as myself do it? And to do that, we're going to sort of very briefly lay out sort of what anthropology and cultural anthropology is, and they're going to move quickly through 3 key terms that are kind of like really broadly going to be useful in the context of this course as we move forward, right? So, first of all, what is anthropology? It's a long story. This is not an intro to anthropology course, so we're going to keep it in super succinct form here. At least in the United States, there's a kind of 100+ year history of what's called a kind of 4 subfields approach. So there's cultural anthropology, there's linguistic anthropology, there's archaeology, and there's what's now called biological or bioanthropology. And the reason for that, and you'll notice immediately that spans like everything from the humanities to the social sciences to the hard sciences or the natural sciences, because it's one of the few fields that historically has had an incredibly broad and ambitious kind of focus on kind of the human condition itself, like the sort of species, our species, its condition itself, right? So both deep past, recent past, and present and future, right? Both the sort of evolutionary origins of our species, and then, all the way up to the sort of present contemporary dilemmas that we face, cultural, political, social, historical, whatever they might be, right? It's a very, very broad and ambitious field in that sense. I'm a cultural anthropologist, which will become a lot kind of clearer through the kind of 3 key concepts I'm going to introduce in just a second. The shorthand that I have for it, because that's very broad, and abstract, is that arguably anthropology, the field of anthropology, is the only place where it might be possible to study something like punk rock, like we're going to do in this course, and primate behavior, right, in the same building, right, amongst the same kind of group of people. Lots of diversity in views and outlooks and methods, but at the end of the day, a sort of basic concern with why is it humans do the things that they do? How do they do certain things? All of them do them, and other things it's really, really divided up by different kinds of differences, right, across different human groups, right? Fundamentally what anthropology is about. Now, on to what cultural anthropologists do, and these key concepts that I want to talk us through today. It's a long story. We could, belabor the point endlessly, but I'm going to try not to do that. I want to emphasize 2 or 3 really basic things that are pretty commonly shared across a lot of cultural anthropology. We tend to think in terms of the collective, like sort of the concepts that we use, the analytical concepts that we use are often construed as kind of part of collective experience rather than like individual experience, right? Not that the individual isn't part of it, but it's sort of the collective realm that we're most interested in typically, right? As you could have seen sort of implicitly in the way that we just did a deep reading of a particular song as like the point of departure, we're really into doing deep interpretations, like sort of like getting past surface level, superficial, easy readings, as it were, of something and delving deep, right? Sort of finding multiple different kind of layers in the interpretation. So deep interpretation. Culture, as we're going to go on to show in just a second, is a kind of overarching category. It has been for many, 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 many years. It's in the very sort of, term itself, cultural anthropologist, and we'll sort of briefly define that in a second. And although it's not exclusively a qualitative field, it's heavily qualitative, right? So instead of sort of wrestling constantly with sort of macro statistics and big numbers and big surveys, we're often interested in kind of the minutia and sort of qualitative readings of things, right? Of the way people act and the things that they do. Okay, so we're going to close out today with a very brief sort of series of comments about 3 key terms that are kind of like background terms for what we're doing, right? The first of those, and it's embedded in the sort of disciplinary approach itself, is the term culture, right? From a cultural anthropologist, have some basic sense of what culture is. And I asked you to go read, if you haven't done it yet, at some point this week, that Raymond Williams piece, which is just a kind of short overview of the very, very incredibly long-term trajectory or etymology of this word, right? As he says pretty forthrightly, culture is one of the 2 or 3 most complicated words in the English language. That's because it's been around for a very long time, and it's taken on a series of really, really different and complicated meanings, all right? And I only want to highlight a couple of those, all right? Because we could go on for an entire class about the whole long-term, centuries-long etymology of this word. For our purposes, what I want to emphasize is basically 2 things. First of all, it implies plurality and localization. Plurality in the sense that there's not one human culture, there's many, many, many human cultures, okay? There's a plurality of them, not a singularity of them, right? And they're localized in the sense that like they sort of spring up and develop and evolve and transform slowly over time in relation to a variety of other things that are kind of localized in space, right? In particular places and according to particular kind of human groups, right? So language, right? The particular language or languages that you speak, the sort of thought or worldview that you have, right? And share with other people versus, other worldviews that exist or other sort of thought patterns that exist in other parts of the world amongst other people. The kind of collective habits or practices or behaviors that are clearly cultural, they're learned, right? They're not innate, they're not born with you, they're sort of learned through practice via the context, the cultural context that you find yourself in, familial context, all those kinds of things. The various very fine-grained contextual meanings that we can give to things which are specific to a particular kind of cultural location, and or even the historical period, like sort of even if it's the same kind of, roughly speaking, the same kind of group, like Americans of 2 centuries ago were not the exact same Americans of today. So the sort of, the shifting winds of history also influence the kind of cultural identity and outlook that people have, right? So plural and localized in that sense and related to all these other complicated sort of collective aspects of ourselves, right? Language, thought, worldview, habits, contextual meaning, historical period. It's also a realm that should be thought of in analytical terms as oftentimes in conflict and in exchange, as this sort of second point suggests to you, right? So if it's a sort of collective realm of human expression, of different collective realms of human expression, it oftentimes is internally divided or segmented or fragmented in different kinds of ways by various things, right? By the various kind of symbolic hierarchies that we talk about popular culture over here, we talk about high culture, the opera is supposedly high culture, right? Beyonce's latest video is popular culture, right? We sort of make these kinds of symbolic differentiations between different segments or realms of cultural expression. It's also heavily, heavily subject to the kinds of divisions we experience all the time along other axes, right? So ethnicity, race, your class background, your gender, sexuality, your religious background, your nationality, the language you speak, all of these different kinds of things are sort of dividing factors that will influence the kind of cultural identity you feel like you belong to or pertain to or do not, right? Or are engaged with. And then, you know, instead of conceptualizing these things as like completely separate spheres, like culture 1 is over here and culture 2 is over here and culture 3 is over here, it's really more complex than that. They're sort of in constant exchange and interchanges with each other, right? As sort of history progresses, right? So it's not, you know, sort of not really useful to think of them as like completely holistically separate entities off, you know, amongst themselves, each culture. They've constantly been sort of exchanging things and borrowing things and appropriating things throughout human history, right? So you can think of these as kind of like nested categories, right? Sort of culture is here, expressive culture is here, subversive culture is in that one, right? Sort of 1, 2, 3. Sort of, we're getting just sort of a little bit more narrow with each key term here. Expressive culture is a particular realm within any particular cultural form or formation that is sort of primarily located within the aesthetic or artistic or creative realms, right? And as a result of that, articulated through multiple media, film, television, nowadays internet, and you know, olden days, literature, books, video, music, etc. All these different kind of media that we have to express cultural forms or cultural expressions. So sort of in a basic sense, that's what we mean by expressive culture, something that sort of puts the emphasis on the creative and on the artistic, and that's communicated through one of these various kind of platforms or mediums that's useful for communicating those kinds of things. It can also be live and in person, but communicated through some perhaps very meaningful sensorial bodily experience, dance, live music as opposed to recorded music or videos, obviously, sort of live performance, humor, stand-up comedy, all of these kinds of things are sort of live instantiations of expressive culture, right? So it can be either in a kind of disseminated, right, sort of mass media form, or it can be in a kind of live performative context as well. And then the second dimension of expressive culture that I want to emphasize here, and that'll sort of be sort of constantly coming out of the things that we look at as we move forward in the course, is that the messages, like sort of the interpretations one can do, the messages one can read into expressive culture, sometimes are very overt. They kind of immediately come out and slap you in the face. Other times they're really pretty buried and kind of implicit, right? So it requires a lot of work to kind of get at that deeper level of interpretation, right? We'll close out on this, again, nested concepts, culture. Expressive culture, within expressive culture, I'm just trying to sort of delineate or identify a particular kind of expressive culture that we're going to focus on in this particular course, which I call subversive culture. And the basic two-part definition here is that we're talking about a particular kind of expressive culture that really explicitly seeks to challenge rather than reinforce a particular norm or, you know, sort of structure of normativity, right? And the various kind of judgments, normative judgments that often come implicit with that norm, right? And that structure of normativity. Something that's sort of seeking to challenge it. That doesn't mean that these kinds of subversive culture do it all in exactly the same way. As I'm suggesting here, there might sort of be a really full range. Some of it might be quite subtle, might be sort of presented as a very subtle critique of the norm or normativity. It might be so obvious and so shocking that it kind of slaps you in the face. It might be simply bizarre or sort of invoke a kind of a response of almost feeling disturbed or sort of confused, right, as a strategy precisely to kind of ask you to start asking questions, right, about various kinds of normative structures, right? So there's not one way of doing subversive culture. There's multiple ways, right? It's kind of a range, and we'll be looking at different ones. Some of them are going to be very, very sort of in your face. Others much more sort of hard to kind of read what the message is, right? But the fundamental message is about challenging structures of normativity. Finally, the second sort of important thing I want to emphasize here about this category of subversive culture, which is crucial to the way the course develops as we move forward, is that essentially what these things have in common is that they're trying to cultivate or develop, right, position themselves as part of a stance of nonconformity, to identify a particular norm or norms, right, and then cultivate a stance of nonconformity in relation to those norms or that structure of normativity. And by virtue of doing so, suggest that kind of in the broader cultural scheme or in the broader kind of society or segment of society that the particular, you know, nugget of subversive culture is speaking to, there are others who are consciously or unconsciously following those norms, right? Sort of, and reinforcing, maybe not just following blindly, but kind of reinforcing consciously or unconsciously those norms on other people, right? So it's sort of, again, to go back finally to this duality that we started with, and that was the inspiration of the course, nonconformity and its challenges, right? Its attempts to challenge the problem of normativity. That's what this course is about.